2 in the morning, a man hidden inside a damp black coat stepped into the late-night gas station, carrying with him the cold of the rain outside. He did not take off his leather gloves, and he absently rolled a tarnished silver coin across his fingers out of pure habit, then set it down on the counter as he pulled out cash to pay for the bitter coffee he had ordered, only to wash the metallic taste of a bad night out of his throat. Stamped on the face of the coin was a falcon clutching a broken chain. Nora, the night shift clerk worn down by her debts, glanced down at it, and she murmured in a listless, exhausted voice, "Sir, my mother has a coin exactly like that one." The man froze. He did not move. He stopped breathing. Because what Nora did not know was that her careless remark had just torn open a grave that had been sealed shut for 12 years and had set her standing squarely on the landmine of an entire ruthless mafia empire. This is the story of one of the coldest crime bosses in the harbor city, and a girl worn to the bone by the weight of her own life. Two people who seemed to come from two worlds that would never touch. On one side stood Dominic Falcone, a man who held the docks, the unions, and half the powerful people of this city in the palm of his hand. A man who had learned that everything he touched broke apart, and so he kept the whole world exactly one arm's length away, even behind a thin skin of leather over his own hands. On the other side stood Nora Keene, a girl who had understood since she was 17 that safety was only a beautiful lie, who by day sat at the bedsides of the dying, and by night drowned in debts she could never pay off, and who no longer had the strength to care what kind of man the stranger in the expensive coat might be. Two people who seemed never to share a single thing in common, and yet they were bound tightly together by something impossibly small, a single old silver coin, and a secret that had been buried for 12 long years, a secret that needed only to be stirred to make blood spill. And tonight's story will begin from that very moment of fate, when a careless word from an exhausted girl accidentally brushed against the grave that an entire criminal empire believed had been sealed forever. 3 seconds passed in that silence, 3 seconds during which Dominic Falcone didn't blink or move a single muscle in his stone-cold face, while only his gloved hand slowly tightened around the coffee cup until the leather stretched taut. He'd learned long ago that a man who revealed his emotions was a dead man, so he swallowed the shock all the way down into the pit of his stomach and lifted his gaze to the clerk working the night shift, fixing her with a stare that everyone who had ever faced it remembered until their final breath. "What did you just say?" he asked, his voice dropping to little more than a murmur, yet somehow making the air inside the gas station feel thick and heavy, the voice of a man accustomed to giving orders in rooms where no one dared speak without permission. Nora Keene looked up from the cash register, faltering slightly at the sudden change in the man who, only moments before, had sat as still as a statue, and the instinctive wariness honed by years of struggling to survive immediately rose inside her like a wall. "It was nothing," she replied, trying to keep her tone indifferent. "It's just that your coin looks like something my mother keeps at home. She has an old music box she's kept since I was little, and there are a few odds and ends inside it." I spoke without thinking. "Forget it." She lowered her head and wiped a streak of coffee from the counter, trying to look busy, but her calloused hands were trembling slightly, and he didn't miss it. Dominic didn't press her at once, because he understood that cornering a wary animal would only make it run, and what he needed now wasn't a hurried answer. What he needed was time, to make certain he hadn't misheard her, to make certain that the grave he'd spent 12 years filling with his own hands had truly cracked open before him, here in this filthy gas station, because of a few careless words spoken by a woman who looked as though a strong enough gust of wind might carry her away. He allowed his shoulders to relax, deliberately easing the tension from his face, and then forced a smile, thin and courteous and so perfectly composed that it never reached his eyes, the kind of smile he always used when he needed someone to believe he was harmless. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice softening as though that sudden coldness had never been there. "I haven't slept much these past few nights, so you caught me off guard. This coin is a family heirloom. I was told it was one of a kind, so hearing you say that surprised me. I'm sure it's only a coincidence." Nora shrugged, unwilling to argue with a stranger at 2 o'clock in the morning. She only wanted to finish her shift and go home to see whether her mother had taken her medicine, so she pushed the hot coffee across the counter toward him, along with the crumpled receipt. He took it with his gloved hand, placed a neatly folded bill on the counter, then added several more beside it, far more than a cup of coffee was worth, enough to make her look up at him with faint suspicion. "Keep the rest," he said quietly. "Consider it my thanks for making coffee for a man who can't sleep." While she awkwardly gathered the money, his gaze moved over the yellowed shift schedule taped to the wall behind her, where a name had been hastily written in ballpoint pen: Nora K., night shift, with her work schedule for the entire week listed beneath it. He committed every detail to memory with the cold, exact precision of a machine, along with her weary face, the faint scar on her forearm exposed beneath the rolled sleeve of her flannel shirt, and the way she kept glancing toward the door as though she were always waiting for something terrible to come through it. He lifted the coffee cup, gave her a small nod in polite farewell, then turned and walked outside. The bell above the door chimed once more as it closed behind him, leaving Nora alone beneath the cold fluorescent lights, completely unaware that the man who had just left would never leave her alone again, and that from the moment she'd carelessly mentioned her mother's music box, her life, already burdened by far too much loss, had officially turned onto a path from which there would be no return. The black car was waiting for him at the far edge of the lot, where the sodium light did not reach, and Dominic Falcone slid into the back seat without a word, the door closing behind him with a heavy, upholstered thud that sealed away the hum of the highway and the buzzing neon of the gas station he had just left. Kane glanced at him in the mirror, reading the stillness in his boss the way an old sailor reads a change in the wind, and knew better than to speak. So the engine idled low in the dark while Dominic pulled off one leather glove and turned the tarnished silver coin over and over between his bare fingers, the falcon and the broken chain catching what little light there was, and for the first time in years, the smooth weight of the thing in his palm felt less like an heirloom and more like a wound reopening. He had not let himself think about that night in a long time, but the girl's careless words had cracked something loose, and now the memory came back uninvited the way memories always do, the memory of standing at the edge of a grave 12 years ago, while the rain came down in cold gray sheets, soaking through the shoulders of a suit that had been too big for him then, a young man of 22, who had not yet learned to keep his grief behind glass, watching a casket sink into the mud that held the body of his older brother Elias. Elias, who had been the anointed one, the golden son who spoke of pulling the family out of the shadows and into the daylight of clean money and legitimate names. Elias, who had died in a car that erupted into flame on a quiet street, a blast that everyone agreed had not been an accident, but a thing carefully arranged by someone who wanted him gone. And Dominic remembered how, as the rain ran down his face and mixed with something he refused to call tears, a soft hand had settled on his shoulder from behind, cool and steady and reassuring, the hand of his Aunt Vivian, who had leaned close and murmured that grief was a luxury he could no longer afford, that the family needed a spine of iron now, and that he was the only one hard enough to give it one, and how those words had felt in that moment like the only warmth in a freezing world, like a lifeline thrown to a drowning boy, never once suspecting that the hand on his shoulder might have been the same hand that lit the match. He closed his fingers around the coin until its edges bit into his skin, because he knew a thing that no outsider could know, a thing guarded like a state secret within the walls of his family, which was that his father had commissioned only 3 of these coins in his entire life, cast from the same silver, stamped with the same falcon clutching the same broken chain, and given to the 3 men he trusted above all others, and Dominic could account for every one of them. One had come down to him from his father and never left his person. One had been laid in the earth with Elias, buried in the breast pocket of his brother's finest coat, and no living hand had touched it since. And the third, The third had belonged to Gideon Marsh, the underboss the whole city still spat about when they dared speak the name at all, the trusted lieutenant who had been branded the traitor, the one blamed for the money that vanished, and the brother who burned, the ghost who had slipped away into nothing 12 years ago, and had never once surfaced in all the years Dominic had spent tearing the world apart in search of him. That coin should have gone into the ground with the man, or into the sea with his bones. It should have followed Gideon Marsh into whatever hole he had crawled into to die, and yet somehow, impossibly, an exact and undeniable twin of it sat inside a battered music box in the home of a mother that an exhausted night clerk had mentioned as casually as she might mention the weather. And Dominic Falcone understood with a cold and rising certainty that the past he had spent a decade trying to bury alive had just found a door back into the world, and it had chosen to open it through a girl named Nora. It was nearly 4 in the morning when Nora Keene finally flipped the sign on the gas station door and killed the outdoor lights, and the drive home in her rattling second-hand hatchback passed the way it always did, in a fog of exhaustion so complete that she could hardly remember pulling into the cracked lot of her apartment building afterward, only that she had, and that her body carried her up 3 flights of stairs out of pure habit, because her mind had long since checked out. The apartment she shared with her mother was small and worn at every edge, but scrubbed almost violently clean, the one thing Nora could still control in a life that had taken nearly everything else, and the smell of antiseptic wipes and cold chamomile tea met her at the door, the way it did every night when she came home from one job, only to prepare for the next. She let herself in quietly, easing the deadbolt shut behind her, and found her mother exactly where she had left her, sitting in the sagging armchair by the window, with a blanket over her knees and the muted television painting shifting blue light across her thin, hollowed face. Adele Keene had once been a sharp and formidable woman. Nora remembered that much from a childhood that felt like it belonged to someone else, but the illness that had crept into her brain over the last few years had scattered her like leaves in a wind, taking her memory and her words, and sometimes her very sense of who and where she was, leaving behind a stranger who wore her mother's face, though there were still moments, terrible and fleeting, when the fog would part and the old Adele would surface for a heartbeat before sinking again. "Mom," Nora said softly, crouching beside the chair and checking the little plastic pill organizer on the side table, relieved to find the evening compartment empty. "You took your medicine. Good, that's good." And she pulled the blanket higher over her mother's shoulders, with the same gentle, practiced hands she used all day long on the dying strangers she was paid so little to care for, hands that knew how to be tender because tenderness was the only thing she had left to give. For a moment, Adele's clouded eyes seemed to focus, and she caught her daughter's wrist with a startlingly strong grip, her voice dropping to an urgent whisper as she said, "Did you lock all the doors, Nora? Lock every one of them. They come when it's quiet. They always come when you think it's finally over." And Nora felt the familiar cold prickle at the back of her neck that these lucid warnings always brought, because there was something in them that sounded less like the ramblings of a sick woman and more like the memory of a real fear once lived. "It's locked, Mom. Everything's locked. We're safe," she murmured, though she did not entirely believe her own words. And after settling her mother, she went down the narrow hall and knelt before the low bookshelf where, on the bottom shelf, behind a stack of yellowed paperbacks, sat an old wooden music box that had followed them through more moves than Nora could count. She lifted the lid, and the tiny mechanism gave a few broken, off-key notes before dying, and inside, among a handful of faded photographs and papers she had never dared look at too closely, lay the heavy silver coin with the falcon and the broken chain, cold and dull in her palm. She turned it slowly in her fingers, thinking of the stranger in the black gloves, and the way his whole body had gone still when she mentioned it, the way his eyes had changed, and she carried it back down the hall and held it out toward her mother, asking quietly, "Mom, this coin, where did it really come from? Who gave it to you, please? I need you to remember just this once." But Adele only stared at the little silver disc with an expression Nora could not read. something between terror and grief, her lips pressing into a thin, trembling line as she turned her face away toward the window and said nothing at all. Nora sat with her a while longer in the blue dark, the unanswered question hanging heavy between them, and then she closed her fingers around the coin and made up her mind that in the morning she would take it to someone who bought old silver, sell it for whatever it was worth, and be rid of the strange weight it seemed to carry, never imagining that the small, dull thing in her hand was the only thing standing between her mother and a grave that had been waiting patiently for 12 long years. The car had not moved from the shadowed edge of the lot, and for a long while Dominic said nothing at all, only sat with the coin closed in his bare fist and his eyes fixed on the middle distance, until Kane finally broke the silence with the low gravel of his voice, asking whether they were driving anywhere tonight, or whether they meant to watch the gas station until sunrise, and only then did Dominic slide the glove back onto his hand, finger by finger, the way another man might load a weapon, and say the name he had not spoken aloud in years, Gideon Marsh. Kane's hands tightened almost imperceptibly on the wheel, because that name was a ghost story in the Falcone family, a curse muttered only in the lowest of voices, and he turned slightly in his seat to study his boss's face before saying carefully that Gideon Marsh was dead, or as good as dead, gone into the ground or the harbor a dozen years past, and asked what a dull piece of silver in some tired girl's apartment could have to do with a man everyone had long ago given up for buried. Dominic explained it in the flat, precise tone he used when he was thinking 3 moves ahead, reminding Kane of the thing they both knew, that Gideon Marsh had once been the underboss of this family, the second most trusted man beneath Dominic's own father, a hard and loyal soldier who had risen higher than his birth ever should have allowed, until the night the family was torn apart from the inside, the night Elias burned and a fortune in the family's money simply evaporated, and Gideon Marsh vanished along with it, leaving behind only his name to be nailed up like a traitor's head on a spike. For 12 years Dominic had hunted that ghost with a patience that bordered on madness, tearing through every associate, every safe house, every offshore account and false passport the man might have touched, and had found precisely nothing, not a body, not a trail, not so much as a whisper, because Gideon Marsh had been a man who left no loose threads, and the file they had built on him over all those years was thick as a phone book yet said, in the end, almost nothing about the man himself, only that he had been born poor, risen fast, trusted absolutely, and that according to every record the family had ever pulled, he had died alone in the world, no wife listed anywhere, no children, no living kin to mourn him or carry his name. And that, Dominic said quietly, is the part that has kept me awake since that girl opened her mouth, because a man who owns nothing and loves no one has nothing to protect and no reason to hide anything, and yet somewhere out there a woman keeps his coin in a music box and warns her daughter to lock every door as if the wolves might still come, which means the file lied, which means someone made it lie, which means there was a wife or a woman or a family that the most thorough family in this city somehow never found in 12 years of looking. Kane asked the obvious question, whether he should send men to the apartment tonight and bring the girl and her mother in, and for a moment the car was silent enough to hear the tick of the cooling engine, before Dominic said no, sharp and immediate, that they would not drag a frightened girl and a sick old woman out of their beds over a coin, that the clerk had looked at him without the faintest flicker of recognition and had spoken of the thing as innocently as a child, which meant she did not know what she was sitting on, and a person who did not know what she held was far more useful, left exactly where she was. He wanted Kane to dig instead, quietly and completely, to find out everything about the girl called Nora and the mother she went home to pull every thread until the whole hidden shape of it came loose, and above all, not to lay a single finger on either of them until Dominic himself understood what he was truly looking at. Because if that coin was real, then the ghost he had chased for 12 years was not as dead as the whole world believed, and Dominic Falcone had learned long ago that the most dangerous thing a man could do was reach into the dark before he knew exactly what was waiting there to close its hand around his. By the middle of the following afternoon, Kane had come to the study on the top floor of the Falcone house, with a thin folder in his hand, and an expression that Dominic had learned to read as trouble, and he set it down on the heavy desk without being asked, saying that he had spent the night and most of the morning pulling every thread he could find on the girl and her mother, and that what he had found, or rather what he had failed to find, was the strangest thing he had come across in all his years doing this work. The girl was easy enough, he explained. Nora Keene, 20 and 9 years old, no criminal record to speak of, drowning quietly in the kind of medical debt that swallows people whole, working herself to the bone between a job caring for the dying by day and the graveyard shift at that highway station by night. An ordinary and unremarkable life of the sort that produced no secrets worth burying. But the mother, Kane said, the mother was where it all came apart, because Adele Keene simply did not exist before a certain point. No birth record under that name, no schooling, no work history, no marriage, no fingerprints in any system, nothing at all, as though the woman had been born fully grown out of empty air. And the point at which she first appeared in the world, the first date attached to the name Adele Keene anywhere, was exactly 12 years ago, the very year the family had been torn open, the very year Elias had died, and Gideon Marsh had vanished into smoke. Dominic went very still behind the desk, the way he had gone still at the gas station counter, and he asked Kane whether he was certain of the date, whether there was any chance of error, and Kane shook his head slowly and said there was no error, that a woman did not scrub her own past this cleanly by accident, that this was not the messy trail of someone hiding from a bad marriage or a debt collector. This was surgical, this was professional. Someone with real access and real skill had gone into the deepest records and erased Adele Keene from before that year, as though she had never lived, and had done it well enough that it had held for over a decade. And that, more than the coin, more than anything, was what made the cold settle into Dominic's chest and stay there, because he understood at once what it meant, that the Falcone family did not miss things, that they owned the clerks and the databases and the men who kept the records, that in 12 years of turning the city inside out looking for Gideon Marsh, they should have stumbled over a hidden wife the way a man stumbles over a body in a dark room. And yet they never had, which meant she had not simply hidden from them. It meant someone on the inside, someone with the family's own keys, had reached in and buried her too deep for even the family to find, had protected this woman from the very people hunting the man she belonged to. Dominic sat with that thought turning slowly and terribly in his mind, the first cold edge of a suspicion he did not yet dare name, and he told Kane to keep digging, to go deeper still, to find out who had touched those records and when, no matter whose fingerprints turned up on them, and Kane nodded and went to do it. Neither of them aware in that moment that the very act of pulling so hard on those long buried threads had sent a faint tremor down a wire that ran into the dark heart of the family itself, that somewhere behind a warm and smiling face, an alarm had just begun to sound, and that by reaching into the past to learn its secrets, Dominic had unknowingly told the one person who feared those secrets most that after 12 safe and silent years, someone had finally started to dig. The bell above the gas station door rang again the next night just past 2 in the morning, and Nora looked up from the counter to see the same man in the dark coat step in out of the drizzle, though this time there was no coin turning in his gloved fingers and no ledger of menace hanging off his shoulders, only a quiet, almost careful stillness, as if he had made some deliberate effort to seem smaller than he was, and something about that studied gentleness set her more on edge than open threat would have. She had told herself all the previous day that she had imagined the strangeness of him, that a rich insomniac who overtipped was hardly worth losing sleep over, and yet the sight of him crossing the fluorescent-lit floor toward her made her stomach drop, because ordinary customers did not come back 2 nights running to a station in the middle of nowhere, and ordinary customers did not look at a tired clerk the way this man looked at her, as though she were a puzzle he had already half solved. He stopped a polite distance from the counter and said good evening in that low voice of his, and told her he would not keep her long, and then, before she could offer him coffee or ask what he wanted, he said the thing that stole the breath from her lungs, that he understood she had gone into a shop earlier that day to have an old silver coin appraised, and that the man behind the glass had taken one look at it and refused to touch it, had all but pushed her back out onto the street. The blood drained from Nora's face, because there was no way, no possible way this stranger could know that, unless he had been watching her, unless he had been having her followed through the ordinary hours of her ordinary miserable day, and she took a small step back from the counter, her hand drifting instinctively toward the little panic button mounted just beneath its lip, the one the owner had installed after the last late-night robbery, her fingers finding the cold plastic of it and hovering there while her heart slammed against her ribs. "Don't," he said quietly, not a threat but almost a request, watching her hand the way a man watches a snake he does not wish to startle, telling her that pressing it would only bring some sleepy sheriff's deputy an hour too late to help her with anything that actually mattered, and that he had not come here to hurt her, that if he had wanted to hurt her he would not have come alone, and he certainly would not have knocked. She kept her fingers near the button anyway, and demanded in a voice she fought to keep steady to know who he was and what he wanted, and why a man like him cared about a piece of junk silver, and he answered her question with a question of his own, asking whether the appraiser had told her why he would not buy it, and when she said nothing he told her himself, that the man had refused because stamped into that coin was a falcon clutching a broken chain, and that in this city there was not a pawnbroker or a fence or an honest jeweler alive who did not know that mark on sight, that the falcon was the sign of the Falcone family, worn on their rings and carved above their doors and pressed into things that were never, ever meant to leave their hands, and that any man who valued his fingers knew better than to be caught buying or selling something that carried it. Nora felt the floor tilt beneath her, because all her life her mother had been a woman afraid of shadows, a woman who moved them from town to town in the dead of night, and paid for everything in cash, and flinched at knocks on the door. And Nora had always told herself it was the sickness, or bad nerves, or the ghost of some cruel man in their past. But standing here now under the buzzing lights she understood for the first time that her mother had not been running from a bad memory at all. She had been running from something with a name and a crest and long, patient arms, something that had apparently just walked through her door in a pair of black leather gloves, and she heard herself ask, in barely more than a whisper, what he wanted from a dying woman and her worthless daughter, her hand still trembling against the panic button she no longer quite believed could save her. Dominic opened his mouth to answer her, to find some gentler shape for the truth that would not send her bolting for the back door, and that was the exact moment the bell above the entrance rang for a third time that night, except this time, no one paused to let the door swing shut behind them. This time, two men came through it fast and hard, and Dominic knew what they were before he had fully turned around, knew it from the way they moved, and the way their eyes swept the little store, and settled not on the register, but on the girl behind the counter, and in the space of a single breath, he understood the terrible arithmetic of it. That his own hands pulling on those buried records the day before had traveled down some hidden wire into the dark, that somewhere a warm and smiling person had felt the tremor and decided that a loose thread 12 years old had to be cut tonight before it could be followed any further, and that these two were the Shears. The larger of them said Nora's name, not as a question but as a confirmation, and reached into his jacket, and Nora's fingers finally closed on the panic button and pressed it, but Dominic already knew what he had told her a moment before, that help would come an hour too late, and so he did not wait for the sound of it, he moved. There was no drawn weapon, no roar of gunfire, only the swift economy of a man who had done this too many times, and Dominic seized the heavy glass coffee pot warming on its plate beside him, and hurled the scalding contents across the first man's face, and in the half-second, the intruder recoiled with a strangled cry, and clawed at his eyes. Dominic was already inside his reach. Driving him backward into the tall wire rack of chips and candy, so that the whole thing came down around them in a clattering avalanche, and by the time the second man had cleared his jacket, Dominic had closed the distance and caught his wrist and turned it hard against the joint until the weapon dropped and clattered under the counter, following it with a short, brutal blow to the ribs that folded the man over and put him down among the scattered wreckage of the shelf, wheezing on the tile. It was over almost before it had begun. 10 seconds, perhaps 12, and then the little store was quiet again, except for the ringing hum of the fluorescent lights, and the low groans of the two men on the floor, and Nora's own ragged, disbelieving breathing. And she stood pressed back against the cigarette case with both hands over her mouth, staring at the stranger who had walked in twice now wearing the face of a quiet insomniac, and had just, in the space of a dozen heartbeats, dismantled two armed men with nothing but a coffee pot and his bare gloved hands. Dominic straightened his coat with a small, unhurried motion, not even breathing hard, and did not so much as glance at the men he had put down, and instead he stepped over the fallen rack and came around the counter toward her slowly, his palms open and visible, the way a person approaches a frightened animal, and he saw that a fleck of something, coffee or worse, had spattered across the back of her trembling hand where it gripped the counter's edge. Without a word, he drew a folded white handkerchief from inside his coat and reached out and, with a gentleness that was almost unbearable after the violence of the moment before, wiped the small stain from her skin. The same hands that had just broken a man, moving now as carefully as if she were made of something that might shatter, and Nora was too stunned to pull away. When he spoke, his voice was low and even, stripped of all its earlier menace and its earlier softness alike, leaving only a flat and terrible plainness, and he told her the thing she most needed to understand and least wanted to hear, that those men had not come to rob the register, and they had not come for the coin. They had come for her, to end her quietly and be gone, and that the only reason she was still breathing was that he had happened to be standing here when they arrived. And then he said the sentence that turned all the blood in her body to ice water. The sentence that erased every thought of panic buttons and pawn shops and unpaid debts from her mind in a single stroke, telling her gently, as though breaking terrible news to the bereaved, that she needed to think very carefully now. Because if these men had managed to find her here, in the middle of nowhere, on the graveyard shift at a station that was not even under her real name, then it meant they had already found the small, scrubbed apartment where a sick woman sat alone in an armchair in the blue light of a muted television, which meant they had already found her mother. The word mother broke whatever paralysis had been holding Nora in place, and she was already moving before she had decided to, lunging for her keys and her phone, but Dominic caught her lightly by the elbow and steered her toward the door with a firm, unhurried pressure that brooked no argument, snatching her worn canvas bag off its hook behind the counter as they passed. And she twisted against his grip and told him to let go of her, that she did not know him, that she was not going anywhere with a man who had just put two people on the floor with a coffee pot. But he did not slow, and he did not release her. He only pushed open the glass door into the cold drizzle, where a black SUV had already rolled up out of the dark, with its engine running, and its rear door swinging open from the inside. "Get in," he said, and when she planted her feet on the wet pavement and refused, her whole body shaking now with cold and terror, and a stubbornness that surprised even her, he turned to face her, and the careful gentleness was gone from his voice, replaced by something low and hard and absolute, and he told her that the men lying on that floor were not the last two, that others would already be moving, that every second she spent arguing with him in this parking lot was a second closer to her mother sitting alone and defenseless in that armchair when the next ones came through the door, and that she could either get into the car and have a chance of reaching Adele first, or she could stand here and be right about not trusting him, while the only person she had left in the world paid the price for it. That reached her where nothing else could have, and Nora stopped fighting and climbed into the back seat, and Dominic slid in beside her and pulled the heavy door shut with a solid vault-like sound that sealed away the rain, and the driver, the enormous silent man she would later learn was called Kane, put the SUV into gear, and pulled out of the lot fast enough to press her back against the seat. She gave the address in a shaking voice when Dominic asked for it, and told him how long the drive should take, and he leaned forward and said one word to the driver, "Faster," and the city began to blur past the tinted glass in streaks of wet neon, while Nora sat with her hands knotted in her lap, trying to breathe. It was then, in the close dark of the moving car, that she finally turned to the man beside her and asked the question she had been too frightened to ask in the store, "Who are you?" And Dominic was quiet for a moment, watching the streetlights slide across the window, before he answered her in a flat and even voice that carried the weight of a confession. "My name is Dominic Falcone." The name landed on her like a stone dropped into deep water, because even someone like Nora, who had spent her whole life with her head down and her attention fixed on simply surviving from one shift to the next, knew that name the way everyone in this city knew it. A name spoken low and never lightly. A name that meant the docks and the money, and the men who made problems disappear, and she felt the last of her illusions about what was happening to her fall away. He told her the rest without waiting for her to ask. Told her that the coin her mother had kept hidden in a music box for 12 years had been made by his own father, that it had belonged to a man his family had trusted above almost all others, a man who had betrayed them and vanished on the same night that Dominic's older brother had died in a car that everyone agreed had not simply caught fire on its own, and that he had spent the 12 years since tearing the world apart trying to find that man, and never once, in all that searching, had he found the slightest trace of a woman who might have loved him, or a child he might have left behind. Nora sat frozen as the meaning of it settled over her piece by terrible piece. Her mother's fear, the false name, the endless moving, the coin she had nearly sold that very afternoon, and she heard herself say in a small hollow voice that her mother was a dying woman who clipped 2 coupons and watched infomercials and could barely remember her own daughter's name most days, that whatever he thought Adele Keene knew, she was gone, the illness had taken it, and Dominic looked at her with those flat gray eyes and said, "Perhaps, but the people who tried to kill you tonight do not believe that, and neither, I am afraid, do I." And the SUV tore around a corner toward the crumbling apartment building, where a sick woman sat alone in the blue light, waiting for a knock that Nora now prayed with all her heart had not already come. The SUV had barely rocked to a stop at the curb before Nora was out of it and running, and Dominic was a half-step behind her, with a quiet command thrown over his shoulder for Kane to watch the street. And they took the 3 flights of stairs 2 at a time, because the elevator in that building had been broken for as long as anyone could remember, and it was on the 4th floor landing, in the dim hallway that always smelled of damp plaster and someone else's cooking, that Nora stopped so suddenly that Dominic nearly collided with her. The door to the apartment stood ajar, and the cheap wood of the frame around the lock had been splintered inward, and the security chain she checked every single night hung severed and useless against the jamb, cut clean through, and a small broken sound escaped Nora's throat as she moved toward it. But Dominic caught her and pressed her back against the wall with one gloved hand and stepped in front of her, and only then did she see that he had drawn a weapon from beneath his coat, a matte black and purely functional thing that looked wrong in his careful hands, and yet entirely at home there. He nudged the ruined door open with the toe of his shoe, and went in low and silent, and Nora followed on legs that barely held her, and inside the little apartment that she kept so violently clean, everything had been thrown into wreckage, the sagging armchair overturned, the side table knocked flat with the pill organizer scattered across the floor in a spray of tiny colored capsules, the shelves swept bare, and the blue light of the television, still muttering to itself on the wall, washing over all of it. "Mom," Nora breathed, and then louder, "Mom!" But Dominic lifted a hand for silence and stood very still in the narrow hall between the bedroom and the bathroom with his head tilted, listening, until he caught it too, a faint rhythmic sound coming from somewhere close, a soft repetitive scraping, and he moved toward the hall closet, where the sound was strongest, and eased the door open with 2 fingers, while Nora pressed forward beside him. And there, wedged into the back corner behind the winter coats and the vacuum cleaner, folded down as small as a woman could make herself, sat Adele, her knees drawn up to her chest, and her silver hair wild about her hollow face, and in her thin hands she clutched the long iron poker from the fireplace they no longer used, dragging its point back and forth across the floorboards in a slow, steady rhythm, scrape and scrape and scrape, her eyes open very wide and fixed on nothing at all. Nora shoved past everything and dropped to her knees in the dark of the closet and gathered her mother into her arms, saying her name over and over, telling her it was all right, that she was here, that she was safe now, and Dominic quietly lowered his weapon and clicked the safety back into place and slid it away beneath his coat, watching the exhausted night clerk hold the trembling old woman the way one holds something infinitely precious and nearly lost. Adele did not seem to see her daughter at all, her grip never loosening on the iron in her hands, and she murmured in a hollow, faraway voice that came from somewhere 12 years deep. They didn't knock. Gideon always said they would knock first. He promised me they would knock. And the name landed in the ruined room like a stone, and Dominic went very still where he stood, because it was the first time he had heard that name spoken by anyone but himself in longer than he could remember, and to hear it fall so casually from the lips of this broken woman confirmed everything and explained nothing. Whatever had happened here, the wolves had come and torn the place apart, and somehow missed the frightened thing hiding in the closet, and Dominic understood that it was likely the old woman's own terror that had saved her, that she had heard the footsteps on the stairs and folded herself into the dark before the door ever gave way. But he also understood that this small mercy would not come twice, that the men who had done this would return the moment they realized their mistake, and so he crouched down to Nora's level and spoke to her low and firm, telling her to take only what her mother could not live without, the medications, a change of clothes, nothing more, and to do it now, because they had perhaps 3 minutes before this became the most dangerous place in the city, and not 1 second longer. The safe house sat 2 hours north of the city, at the end of a private road that wound up through dark pines, a low structure of concrete and glass that locked itself behind heavy steel doors with a magnetic sound that Nora felt in her teeth, and by the time they arrived, the sky in the east had begun to bruise toward dawn, and her mother had fallen into an exhausted half-sleep against her shoulder, in the back of the SUV. A man called Dr. Sable was waiting for them, a quiet, grave figure who asked no questions and was clearly paid a great deal for that exact silence, and he took Adele gently away to one of the bedrooms to examine her, while Nora hovered helplessly until Dominic steered her into the vast cold kitchen and set a glass of water in front of her on the marble island, and told her to drink, and she looked at the glass, and then at him, and did not touch it, and asked instead, in a raw voice, what happened now. He answered her plainly, the way he seemed to answer everything, telling her that the life she had been living was over, that she could not go back to the station, or to the day job caring for the dying, or to the apartment with the broken door, that all of it had ended the moment those 2 men walked through the door, and Nora felt something in her chest crack under the flat weight of the words. And she pushed back against them the only way she knew how, with anger, snapping at him that he did not get to decide that she had a mother to care for, and debts that did not care whether men with guns were hunting her, that she could not simply vanish into the woods because a mob boss had decided her life was interesting. He did not rise to it. He only stood across the island from her with his gloved hands resting on the marble, and let her burn herself out, and when she had run down she asked him the question that had been clawing at her since the gas station, the question that turned out to matter more than either of them yet understood. How, she demanded, how does a home health aide and a sick old woman slip through the fingers of a family that owns half this city? You told me yourself you tore the world apart for 12 years looking for this man. So how is it that a dying woman kept his coin in a shoebox the whole time, and none of you ever found her? And Dominic went quiet, because it was the exact question that had kept him awake, the question whose only answer was a shape he did not yet want to look at directly. Before he could shape a reply, Dr. Sable came back into the kitchen, drawing off his gloves, and reported in a low, even voice that the mother's heart was under strain and her condition was advanced and fragile, that the shock of being torn from her home and moved would almost certainly accelerate the confusion, and that what she needed above all was stillness and a settled place. And Dominic said she had one, and told the doctor that Kane would drive him back to the city, and that he was to remain available at any hour. And Sable nodded and gathered his bag and left, and the heavy door sealed behind him with its cold magnetic finality. Nora sank onto one of the stools at last, the fight drained out of her, and buried her face in her hands, and Dominic watched her for a long moment. This exhausted young woman who had stood between him and two armed men only hours before with her hand hovering over a useless panic button, and something in the sight of her trembling shoulders reached a place in him he had kept walled off for a very long time. It was then that his phone buzzed against the marble, and he stepped away into the hall to take it, and it was Kane, and Nora could not hear the words, but she saw the change come over Dominic's face as he listened, saw the last trace of warmth drain out of it and leave behind something colder and far more dangerous than anything the intruders had put there. When he came back into the kitchen, he moved slowly, and he set the phone down with a care that frightened her more than violence would have, and she asked him what was wrong, and he told her in a voice gone very flat and very quiet that Kane had traced the vehicle the two men had come in, that it had not been stolen as such things usually were, that it was registered instead through a shell company, a paper company buried under a dozen others, and that when Kane had followed the trail of that company down through all its false layers it had led, in the end, to an account that belonged to the Falcon family itself, which meant that the men who had come to the gas station to put a bullet in Nora Keene had been sent and paid for not by some outside enemy or old rival, but by someone inside his own house, someone with the family's keys and the family's money and the family's trust. And Dominic Falcone stood in the pale light of the safe house kitchen and understood that the war he had believed he won 12 years ago had never truly ended, it had only been sleeping, and that it had just opened its eyes. The trouble began the following night with a small plastic bottle that Dr. Sable had left behind, because Adele's heart medication was a particular kind not easily found, and by evening the last of it was gone, and the old woman had begun to slip into a labored, gray-lipped distress that made Nora frantic, and there was no choice but to send someone to the one pharmacy 2 towns over that carried it, and Dominic would not send Kane alone, and would not leave Nora and her mother wholly unguarded, and in the end he decided that he and Kane would make the run themselves, while a pair of trusted men stayed behind at the house, because he had also grown uneasy that the safe house had been chosen through the family's own channels, and a location the family knew was a location that the traitor inside it might know as well, which meant they would need to move Adele to somewhere quieter soon regardless, and this errand would let him scout the road. Nora refused to be left behind while her mother's medicine was fetched by strangers, and something in her flat, stubborn insistence made Dominic relent, so the 3 of them took the SUV down the winding pine road in the dark, with Kane at the wheel, and it was on the narrow county highway, at a place where the trees pressed close on both sides and there was nowhere to turn, that the headlights of a truck swung out of a sidetrack and stopped dead across both lanes, and Kane had time only to say one low word before the shooting started. What followed was fast and ugly and mercifully brief, Kane throwing the SUV into a hard reverse as rounds punched into the armored panels, Dominic pulling Nora down flat across the back seat and covering her with his own body as glass spidered above them, and then the 2 men were out and using the doors for cover, and Nora, pressed to the floor with her heart hammering, understood from the clipped shouts that these were not random highwaymen, but men who had been waiting for exactly this car on exactly this road, which meant someone had known they would leave the house tonight, which meant the rot was closer than even Dominic had feared. It ended when Kane put the attacker's truck out of commission, and the surviving men melted back into the trees, rather than face 2 guns in the open, and in the sudden ringing silence, Kane hauled himself back behind the wheel and forced the battered SUV past the wreck and back onto the road at speed. And it was only then, as Nora pushed herself up off the floor with shaking arms, that she saw the dark stain spreading across the upper sleeve of Dominic's coat, where he had been struck shielding her, and saw how carefully he was holding the arm against his side, his jaw set hard against the pain he refused to show. Any other person might have frozen or wept, but Nora had spent years at the bedsides of the failing and the frightened, her hands trained by 100 small emergencies, and something in her went very still and very calm, the way it always did when there was suffering in front of her, that she knew how to ease. And she told Kane to keep driving and not to stop for anything, and she peeled Dominic's coat back from the wound with a firmness that left no room for his objection. It was a graze along the outer arm, ugly but not deep, and she tore strips from the clean spare shirt in the bag they had packed and folded a pad hard against it, to stanch the bleeding, and bound it tight around his arm with the sure, unhurried movements of someone who had done such things in the dark before, murmuring to him without quite realizing she was doing it, the same low, steadying voice she used on her dying patients, telling him to breathe, that it was not as bad as it looked, that she had him. Dominic sat very still under her hands and watched her work, this exhausted girl he had dragged into his war, and found that he could not remember the last time another human being had touched him with the simple intention of easing his pain rather than taking something from him, and something behind his ribs that had been frozen solid for 12 years shifted very slightly, like the first hairline crack running through winter ice. When she had finished and sat back, her hands stained and trembling now that the calm had passed, he told her quietly that they could not go back to the safe house, that the ambush proved the location was known, that whoever was hunting them had watched them leave tonight and would be waiting when they returned. And Nora looked at the blood on her own fingers, and then at the grim faces of the two men, and understood at last, fully, and finally, that there was no version of this where she simply went back to her old life, that the only way out of this dark was straight through it. And she asked him in a small, hard voice who inside his own house hated him enough to do this, and Dominic stared out at the black trees rushing past and did not answer, because the shape he had refused to look at was becoming clearer by the hour, and he was afraid of the face he was beginning to see. They did not go back to the compound in the pines, but to another place Dominic trusted only to himself and Kane, an old lake house that appeared on no family ledger, and by the time Dr. Sable's medicine had steadied Adele's heart, and the old woman had drifted at last into a real sleep, it was deep into the small hours and the house had gone quiet, and Nora too wound up to rest, wandered through the shadowed rooms until she came upon an upright piano standing against the far wall of a den, its wood dulled with dust, clearly untouched for years. She lifted the fallboard almost without meaning to, and laid her fingers on the cool keys, and pressed out a few soft notes into the silence, and the sound of it seemed to open something in her, because she began, haltingly at first, and then more surely, to play, an old and simple melody her hands had not forgotten even after all this time, and she did not hear Dominic come to stand in the doorway with his wounded arm held against his side, watching her. When the last note faded, she said, without turning around, that she used to play, that there had been a time when a teacher told her she could have gone somewhere with it. A scholarship, a school in another city, a whole different life, and that all of it had ended the year her father disappeared, and the fire took their old house and everything in it. The year her mother packed 2 bags in the dark, and they became people who did not stay anywhere long enough to own a piano, and she said it plainly, without self-pity, as though reciting the details of someone else's tragedy, and only the stillness of her shoulders betrayed what it had cost her. Dominic was quiet for a long moment, and then he crossed the room and lowered himself onto the bench beside her, and for a while neither of them spoke, until he said, in a voice she had not heard from him before, that his brother had loved music, that Elias had been the one with the softer heart, the one who spoke of taking the family out of the shadows and into clean daylight, of building something their father's name would not have to be whispered, and that he had died for exactly that dream, in a car on a quiet street on an ordinary evening, in a blast that everyone knew had been arranged by a careful hand, though no hand was ever named. He told her that he had been young then, too young, and that he had let a grief he did not know what to do with harden into something else, into the cold and gloved thing she saw before her now, and that in 12 years he had never once said his brother's name aloud to another living soul. And Nora turned on the bench and looked at him, at the tired lines around his eyes and the wound she had bound with strips of his own shirt, and understood for the first time that the man beside her was not so different from her mother, another survivor who had buried a person alive inside himself and built a fortress of locked doors and false calm around the empty place they left. She reached out, slowly, and rested her small stained hand over his gloved one, where it lay on the piano keys, not to take anything from him, and not asking anything in return, only the plain human weight of one broken person acknowledging another, and Dominic went very still beneath her touch, the way he always did, his instinct screaming at the contact. And yet this time he did not pull away, and for a moment the two of them simply sat there in the dim and dusty room, while a sick woman slept down the hall, and enemies gathered somewhere in the dark, two people the world had frozen solid 12 years apart, feeling the first thin crack of warmth run through the ice, neither of them daring yet to call it what it was. Morning came gray and still over the lake, and Dominic was awake before any of them, sitting alone in the front room with the curtains drawn and the medicine bottle and the falcon coin side by side on the table before him, when he heard the soft shuffle of slippered feet, and looked up to find Adele Keene standing in the doorway, wrapped in one of the oversized sweaters Nora had packed, her silver hair brushed and her face, for once, unclouded. She did not look frightened this morning. She looked eerily calm, and she crossed the room with a slow, deliberate steadiness, and stopped before the table and looked down at the coin, and then she lifted her eyes to his face and studied it the way one studies a portrait of the dead, and she said, in a clear, quiet voice that belonged to a woman he had never met, "You are the younger Falcone, aren't you? Elias's little brother. You have his eyes but not his softness." A cold shock went through Dominic, because he had not told her his name, and she had spent every previous moment lost in a fog that did not know the year, and he rose slowly to his feet and asked her how she knew him, and Adele gave a faint sad smile and said that she had stood across the street in the rain at the funeral all those years ago and watched a boy of 22 try not to weep into the mud, and that she had known even then that the family would use that boy's grief to make a weapon of him. Nora appeared in the hallway, drawn by the voices, and froze at the sight of her mother standing lucid and speaking plainly for the first time in longer than she could remember, and Adele glanced at her daughter with a tenderness that made Nora's throat close, and then turned back to Dominic and said the thing that would break the world open. That he had spent 12 years hating the wrong man, that Gideon Marsh had been a hound, loyal and hard and dangerous, but only ever a hound, and that a hound does not choose the hunt, someone else holds the leash and points him at the throat, and Gideon had never once in his life been the hand that held the leash. Dominic's voice came out rough and low, as he asked her what she meant, whether she was telling him Gideon had not betrayed the family, had not taken the money, had not arranged the blast that killed Elias, and Adele's clear eyes began already to film over at the edges as the fog crept back in, and she said only that Gideon had come home that last night covered in the ash of a fire he had not set, and had told her he was being made to carry something that was never his, that the family would need a dead traitor to bury the truth with, and that if he ran and let them brand him the villain, then the ones he loved might be left alive and forgotten in the dark, which was the one mercy he could still buy them. She swayed slightly, and Nora rushed to steady her, and Adele gripped her daughter's arm and told her, with the last clarity draining out of her voice, to give the man the music box. All of it. The false bottom too. That Gideon had made her swear to keep it hidden until someone came asking the right questions with the right eyes, and that she had waited 12 years and she was so tired now, and that this boy with Elias's eyes was the one. He had finally come. Then the light went out of her face as gently as a candle guttering, and she looked around the unfamiliar room in fresh confusion and asked Nora if they had locked the doors, and the woman who had spoken the truth was gone again, leaving her daughter holding her, and Dominic standing very still with the ground shifting beneath his feet. Understanding for the first time that the ghost he had hunted across 12 years might have been not the architect of his ruin, but only its instrument, and that the real hand, the hand that had held the leash, might belong to someone who had been standing close beside him the entire time. Nora settled her mother back into bed, and stood a long moment in the doorway, watching the old woman sink again into sleep. And then she went and fetched the battered wooden music box from among the few things they had grabbed in those frantic 3 minutes, and she carried it into the front room and set it on the table before Dominic without a word, because whatever hung inside that box had already reached out of the past and nearly killed them both, and there was no unknowing it now. Dominic lifted the lid, and the little broken mechanism gave its few off-key notes and died, and he took out the faded photographs and the folded papers and the silver coin and set them aside, and then he weighed the empty box in his gloved hands and found it heavier than an empty box had any right to be, and he ran his thumb along the inner seam until he felt the give of it, and drew the slim knife from his pocket, and worked the blade into the corner and pried upward until, with a soft crack, a false panel lifted free from the bottom. Beneath it lay a thin leather-bound notebook, gone brittle with age, and a single folded letter, and Dominic opened the notebook first, and found it filled with columns of figures, account numbers, and dates, and routing codes. The hidden ledger of money moved in the dark, and he understood at a glance that this was the very fortune the family had believed Gideon Marsh had stolen 12 years ago, laid out here not as the record of a thief, but as evidence carefully gathered by a man building a case, a man who had known he was being set up, and had kept the receipts. But it was not the numbers that stopped the breath in his chest. It was the handwriting, because the ledger and the letter both were written in a hand he knew as well as his own, an elegant slanted script he had seen on birthday cards, and household accounts, and the fly-leaves of gifted books his entire life. A hand that had signed the notes left on his pillow as a boy, and the terms of 100 family arrangements as a man. And he turned to the last page of the letter, with fingers that had gone cold inside their leather, and there, dated the day before the blast that took his brother, he read a single line that fell through him like a stone through black water. The money is placed, Marsh will carry the blame, the younger one is grieved and pliable, and will take the seat, and it will finally be ours. He read it twice, and the room seemed to tilt, because there was no mistaking that hand. It belonged to his Aunt Vivienne, the woman who had laid her cool, steady palm on his shoulder in the rain, and whispered that he was the only one hard enough to hold the family together. The woman who had raised him after his father passed, and taught him to shoot, and to negotiate, and to trust no one. The woman he had let become the single fixed point of loyalty in his whole cold world, and every kind word she had ever given him rearranged itself now into the patient shaping of a weapon she intended to wield. And while Dominic sat frozen with the ruin of his own history in his hands, Nora had come to read over his shoulder, and she pressed her fingers to her mouth as her own 12 years turned inside out, because the ledger in that elegant murderer's hand meant that the ash her mother spoke of, the fire, the running, the false name, all of it, meant that her father had not been the traitor whose shame she had carried like a stone since she was 17 years old. That Gideon Marsh had been an innocent man, made to wear another's crime, so that a grieving boy could be steered onto a throne, and more than that, she understood now the thing that had baffled Dominic from the start, how a dying woman had slipped through the family's fingers for over a decade, because it had been Gideon himself, in the last hours before he vanished, who had reached into the very records only a trusted underboss could touch, and scrubbed his wife and daughter out of the world, not to hide his crimes, but to hide the 2 people he loved from the wolves who would come for anyone who might one day speak the truth. The same clean surgical erasure Dominic had read as the fingerprints of a guilty man covering his tracks, and had never once imagined was a father's last desperate act of love. The two of them sat there in the gray morning light with the letter between them, a mafia boss who had spent all those long years worshipping his own executioner and hunting an innocent ghost, and a broken girl who had spent that same dark era despising the memory of a father who had given up everything, even his own name and honor, to keep her breathing, and their two long agonies met over the brittle page and became, in that silence, a single unbearable truth, that the real hand which had held the leash had never left the family at all, and that it was still there now, warm and smiling, waiting at the head of Dominic's own table. Dominic called Kane into the front room and laid the ledger and the letter on the table between them, and Kane read the single damning line in silence, and then set his jaw and said what they both already knew, that this changed everything and ended everything, and Dominic told him to pull hard on the last thread, the ambush on the county road, to find whose men had been waiting for them. And it did not take Kane long, because the trail from the truck and the burner phones led to a capo named Rourke, a hard, ambitious man who had risen quietly in recent years, and when Kane cross-checked the payments that had been quietly moving into Rourke's accounts, he found they came dressed through the same layered shell companies whose deepest root ran back to Vivian's own hidden money, which meant Rourke was hers, had likely always been hers, her hand inside the family reaching out to cut the loose thread of Adele Keene before it could ever be followed back to the woman who had smiled at the head of the table for more than a decade. Dominic sat with all of it settling into place, with the cold finality of a lock turning, and then he rose and began, with a terrible calm, to prepare, and told Kane to move quietly against Rourke, and to secure the family's true assets before Vivian understood how much they knew, to lay the trap and hold it, because Dominic himself meant to go to her, tonight, alone in the sense that mattered, and put the truth on the table between them, and see what her face did when she understood the grave had opened. Nora watched him check the matte black weapon and slide spare rounds into his coat with the same meticulous stillness he brought to everything, and she saw that the makeshift binding on his wounded arm had loosened and darkened, and without a word she went and found the small kit Dr. Sable had left, and came back and took his arm and unwound the stained cloth, and cleaned the graze properly this time, and bound it again with fresh white gauze. Her hands steady and sure, and he let her, sitting quietly under her care the way he had in the moving car, and when she had finished and smoothed the edge of the dressing flat, with her thumb neither of them moved to break the small warm silence that had settled over the ritual of it. Then Dominic reached into his coat and took out a heavy iron key and set it on the table beside her, and told her plainly what it opened, that in the floor of the bedroom at the end of the hall, beneath the boards under the rug, there was a safe, and inside it, enough untraceable cash to erase every debt she had ever carried, along with clean papers and the deed to a quiet house in a warm country far from any of this, and he told her that if he did not call this house before dawn, it would mean that Vivian had won, and that she was to take her mother and take the money and disappear the way her father had taught her mother to disappear, and never look back, and never let anyone with a falcon on his ring find them again. Nora looked down at the iron key on the table, and then at the man who had bled shielding her body with his own, and had just handed her the means to walk out of his war, and out of his life with more freedom than she had ever known, and she found she could not speak, because 100 hours ago she would have taken that key without a second thought, and run and been right to run, and now something had shifted in her that she did not have words for, and did not entirely trust. And so she said nothing at all, only held his gaze with an expression caught somewhere between grief and a question she was not yet ready to answer, and Dominic, who had spent his whole life reading the intentions of frightened people and had expected relief or gratitude or the quick calculating light of someone already halfway gone, found that he could not read this silence at all, and it unsettled him more than any answer could have. He held her eyes a moment longer, then drew his gloves back on finger by finger, and turned for the door, leaving the key lying on the table between them like a question neither of them had the courage yet to close, and stepped out into the gathering dark to go and face the smiling hand that had held the leash for 12 years. Vivian Falcone kept her private hours in the glass orangery that jutted from the seaward wing of the family estate, a long, warm room of citrus trees and orchids where she took her tea among things she had coaxed into bloom. And it was there that Dominic found her past midnight, and the two men who should have stopped him at the outer doors did not. Because Kane had gone ahead in the quiet hours and shown certain trusted soldiers the pages written in Vivian's own elegant hand, and men who had served the family out of loyalty to a bloodline do not stay bought once they learn that the woman signing the checks is the same one who murdered the rightful heir, so the guards had simply stepped aside into the dark and let him pass, which was its own kind of verdict. Vivienne looked up from her chair as he came down the aisle of trees, an elegant woman of 62, with silver hair swept back and warm eyes that crinkled at the corners, and she smiled at him the way she had smiled at him his whole life, and said that it was late for a visit, that he looked tired, that he was pushing himself too hard again, and Dominic said nothing, only drew the brittle letter from his coat and laid it on the little table beside her teacup, and watched the smile hold for one heartbeat, two, before it slipped from her face like a mask coming loose, leaving behind something older and colder and entirely unsurprised. She did not reach for the letter, and she did not pretend to misunderstand it. She only set down her tea and folded her hands and looked at him with a terrible composure. And when she finally spoke, there was no denial in it, only the flat, weary patience of someone explaining a hard truth to a slow child. And she told him that Elias would have destroyed them, that his brother had been soft, a dreamer who wanted to hand the docs to lawyers and the family name to charity boards, who would have knelt to the very men their father had spent his life standing over, and that within a few short years there would have been nothing left of the Falcones for anyone to inherit. She said she had done what the family needed and no one else had the stomach to do, that she had looked at two nephews and chosen the one with iron in him, and that Gideon Marsh had simply been the price, a loyal dog who understood, in the end, that his death would buy his family's safety. And Dominic listened to her arrange the murder of his brother and the ruin of an innocent man into an act of stewardship, and something in his chest that had been breaking for days finally went quiet and cold, and he said, in a voice barely above a whisper, that she had made him into a monster. Vivienne looked at him then with what might almost have been tenderness, and told him no, that she had not made him anything, that he had always been a monster underneath, harder and colder than Elias could ever have been, and that all she had done was see it clearly when no one else would, and give that hardness a purpose, that she had not made him a beast, she had simply handed him a crown and let him wear it, and for a moment, the only sound in the glass room was the drip of water among the leaves. Then her composure broke at last, and her hand moved, fast for a woman her age, toward the drawer of the little table where something waited that was not tea, but Dominic had spent his whole life in rooms where hands moved toward drawers, and his own hand was faster. The matte black weapon cleared his coat in a blur, and he fired a single, muffled shot that caught her squarely in the chest before her fingers could even reach the handle, watching the woman who had made him a monster slump softly back into her chair. It ended there, quickly and quietly among the orchids, without spectacle, and without any of the satisfaction he had spent 12 years imagining he would feel. He stood over the stillness afterward in the warm, humid air that smelled of citrus and turned earth, waiting for the closure, the release, the sense of a debt finally paid that had driven him through more than a decade of blood and searching, and none of it came. There was only a vast and echoing emptiness, where all that hatred had lived. Because the ghost he had hunted had been innocent, and the enemy he had finally destroyed had been the closest thing to a mother he had known, and he understood standing there that he had not won anything at all. He had only reached the bottom of the pit he had been falling into since the night his brother's car went up in flame, and found it empty, and himself alone at the bottom of it with the truth. By the time Dominic left the estate, the machinery of the night had already done its quiet work, because Kane had moved against Rourke in the same dark hours, and the capo who had sold his loyalty and waited on a county road to end a girl and her mother was found and dealt with before he ever understood that his patron was gone, and his protection with her. And the soldiers who had stepped aside in the orangery had chosen their side, and would hold it, so that by the thin hours before dawn, the thing was finished, cleanly and completely, the way Dominic finished everything. There would be a reckoning in the days to come. He knew that. A family does not lose the woman who has sat at the head of its table for 12 years without the ground shaking beneath it. There would be old capos to reassure, and frightened lieutenants to steady, and rivals who would smell blood in the water and come circling. And it would fall to him to hold all of it together with the same iron Vivian had shaped him to carry. But that was for later. That was for the daylight. And just now, as the black car carried him north away from the sea, none of it seemed to matter at all. Dominic sat in the passenger seat and watched the sky begin to bruise toward morning, a deep and ugly purple bleeding up behind the pines, and he pulled the glove slowly from his right hand and turned the falcon coin over and over between his bare fingers, the way he had the night this all began. Except that the thing had changed its meaning entirely in the space of a few days, because it was no longer the emblem of a family betrayed by an outsider. It was the emblem of a family that had rotted from its own center while he stood guard at the walls, and he had spent 12 years worshipping the very hand that had hollowed it out. He felt no triumph and no grief that he could name, only the strange weightless exhaustion of a man who has finally set down a burden he carried so long that its absence felt like falling, and beneath that a hollowness he did not know how to fill, because hatred had been the engine of his whole adult life, the thing that got him out of bed and kept the cold at bay, and now that it was spent there, was nothing behind it but the empty rooms of a house he had helped build on a lie. He thought of the innocent man he had hunted across a decade, of Gideon Marsh choosing shame and exile and a lonely unmarked end so that a wife and a daughter might live forgotten in the dark, and he thought that he had done to that man's memory a violence almost as great as the one Vivian had done to his body, and there was no undoing it, no apology that could reach a ghost. And then, without quite deciding to, he thought of the lake house waiting at the end of the road, of a sick woman sleeping, and an exhausted young woman keeping watch beside an iron key on a table, a key he had given her so that she might walk out of his life and be free of all of it, and he realized with a quiet lurch that he did not know whether she would still be there when he arrived, that he had handed her the means to vanish and had no right to hope she had not used it, and that the not knowing frightened him more than the orangery had, more than the county road, more than anything had frightened him in 12 cold and armored years, and he told Kane, in a low voice, to drive faster. The lake house was quiet when Dominic came through the door in the gray light before sunrise, his coat marked with the long night and a fine spatter he had not been able to fully wipe away, and he stopped just inside the threshold because the first thing he saw was the iron key, still lying exactly where he had left it on the table, untouched, and the second thing he saw was Nora, sitting on the low couch in the pale room with her knees drawn up and a blanket over her shoulders, awake, waiting, the safe in the bedroom floor unopened, and the warm country far away, still only a place on a deed she had never gone to claim. She looked up when he entered, and took in the state of him, the blood at his collar, and the hollow weight in his shoulders, and she did not ask him whether it was done, because she could read the answer on him the way she read it on the dying, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, and then Dominic said, quietly, that it was over. That Rourke was handled, and the family was secured, and the people who had hunted her and her mother would never come again, that she was free, and he glanced at the untouched key on the table and told her, in a voice that came out rougher than he intended, that she could take it now, that everything he had promised was still hers, the money and the papers and the quiet house across the sea, that nothing was holding her here any longer. Nora looked at the key for a long moment, and then she looked back at him, and she said the thing that undid 12 years of armor in a single breath. She asked him, softly, if she took the money and walked out that door, would she ever see him again? And Dominic went utterly still, because in all his cold and calculated life, No one had ever taken the gift he offered as a way out, and turned it into a reason to stay. People took what he gave them, and they ran, and they did not look back. That was the only law he had ever known. And here was this exhausted girl he had dragged through fire, sitting with the key to her freedom an arm's length away, and asking instead whether letting her go meant losing him. He crossed the room slowly and lowered himself onto the couch beside her, and he told her the truth as he understood it, that he was a dangerous man in a dangerous world, that the life he led left no room for anything soft, that everything he had ever cared for had been broken by the mere fact of his caring for it, and that she of all people had more reason than anyone alive to take that key and never look upon a falcone again. And Nora looked at him with those tired, clear eyes that had spent so long sitting beside the dying that they had lost all fear of hard truths, and she said that she had spent her whole life being told what the safe choice was, that her mother had run for 12 years and lived every day of them afraid, hiding behind false names and deadbolts that never held, and that she would not do it. She would not spend the rest of her life running from the one place that had made her feel, for the first time since she was 17, that she was not carrying everything entirely alone. For a long moment Dominic could not answer her, and then he did the thing he had not done for another living person in longer than he could remember. He reached up and drew the black leather glove slowly from his hand, finger by finger, bearing the scarred and calloused skin beneath, that he kept always hidden, always at one remove from the world, and he laid his bare hand over her small stained one, where it rested on the blanket between them, palm to palm, nothing between them at last, and Nora turned her hand beneath his and closed her fingers around it, and the two of them sat there in the widening dawn without another word. A man who had spent his whole life keeping the world at exactly one arm's length, and a woman who had spent hers being left behind, holding on now to the one thing neither of them had ever expected to be allowed to keep. A few days later, when the worst of the storm had passed, and the family had begun to settle uneasily beneath Dominic's steady hand, Nora sat at her mother's bedside in the lake house in the soft light of a late afternoon, holding the thin, frail hand in both of hers, and she leaned close and spoke to her the way she had learned to speak to the dying in all her years of that quiet work, gently and without hurry, telling her that it was all right now, that the running was over, that no one would ever come for them again, and then she told her the thing she had waited her whole life to be able to say, that Gideon had been cleared, that the truth had finally come out, that the whole city would know he was never the traitor they had branded him, but an innocent man who had given up everything to keep his wife and his little girl safe, that his name was clean at last. For a moment Adele's clouded eyes drifted, and then, in one final parting of the fog, they cleared and found her daughter's face and truly saw her, and a slow, peaceful smile spread across the old woman's features, the first Nora had seen in longer than she could remember, and Adele murmured that she had kept it all those years just as he asked her to, and that she could rest now, and she closed her eyes still smiling, and not long after, quietly and without fear, the woman who had run and hidden and kept her terrible secret, locked in a music box for 12 long years, finally set the whole weight of it down and let go, slipping away as gently as a candle at the end of its wick, free at last of the shadow that had chased her across half her life. Nora wept, but there was something clean in the grief, because her mother had not died afraid in a locked room the way she had always dreaded. She had died knowing the man she loved was redeemed, and her daughter was safe, and the long vigil was finally, mercifully over. And when Dominic came and stood in the doorway and saw, he did not keep his usual distance, and he did not reach for the armor of his careful stillness. He crossed the room and sat beside Nora, and put his bare arm around her, and simply held her while she cried. A man who for 12 years had touched nothing without a glove between himself and the world, now holding a grieving woman with nothing between them at all, because he had finally understood that the distance he had kept had never once kept him safe. It had only kept him alone. In the weeks that followed, the two of them built something quiet out of the wreckage, a life neither of them had thought the world would ever permit them, and Dominic Falcone, who had spent every night of his adult life sitting where he could watch the door with the whole world held at exactly one arm's length, found that he no longer felt the need to, that he could sit in a warm room with his gloves off and his back to an open doorway, and feel, for the first time since a car burned on a quiet street, something he had almost forgotten the shape of, which was peace. And he realized that after all the years of blood and searching, all he had ever truly wanted was not revenge, and not a throne, but simply this: a person to come home to, and a reason to stop fighting. And he had found it in the last place on earth he would ever have thought to look, across the counter of a highway station, at 2 in the morning, in a tired girl who happened to say the right words to the right ghost. And so their 2 long tragedies, begun 12 years apart, and carried alone through all the dark years between, met at last over a dull silver coin, and became something that could hold light again, proving that sometimes the deepest secrets do not lead us to ruin, but to the one person we were always meant to find, the one who was made to pull us out of the dark. Thank you so much for staying with this story all the way to the end. And if it touched your heart even a little, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel, and to like and share this video, so that we can keep bringing you moving stories like this one, every single day. And we would love to hear from you, so tell us in the comments how this story made you feel, and let us listen to what it stirred deep in your heart, because your words mean the world to us. Until next time, we wish everyone watching good health, a joyful life, and peaceful days ahead, and we hope to see you again in the next video. Goodbye and take care.